Started because I know some folks might join a little late, but I want to use as much time as we can tonight with this group. So welcome everyone again. I'll hand it over to Mattia to get us started, and then I'll jump in when we're ready. Go ahead, Mattia.
Absolutely. Welcome everyone. Thanks, Galina, for the intro. A little reminder about who we are. We are the Neurohumanities Network, and our philosophy is really that of creating a space where the humanities, the arts, and the neurosciences can meet. We are a group of neurologists, of fellows, of trainees, and of students, including myself, Charlie Palmer, Galina Gaiman, Jay Doolittle, Devika Nafade, Rida Farhan, and we're very excited that two of our fourth year medical students just matched into neurology. For those that don't know the world of medicine, that means you go from your neck to your next stage, from being a medical student to being a resident. We also want to acknowledge that our group has the kind support of the Arts and Humanities Initiative at Harvard Medical School. And we also want you to be connected with us. We have these monthly virtual seminars, such as today. We also have a monthly newsletter. We also have a monthly booster series of session where we focus more on the practice of the neurohumanities. Now, how you can stay in touch with us is via social media, via X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Skype. We also have a YouTube channel where our recorded lectures can be found for those presenters that agree to it. And we have an upcoming website for those that have been with us before. We've seen that it's upcoming, but it's really upcoming. So stay tuned for this. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Galina, who will introduce the very exciting speaker we have today.
Thanks, Mattia. And I could not be more excited to host Usaamah tonight for the Neurohumanities Network talk. Myself have been on the seat waiting for this talk for months, ever since I found out this, well hidden secret of this other side of Dr. Khan. We have a few things in common. We both came from Canada, at the University of Toronto. We both suffered many long nights in the neuro ICU, where he was my fellow and I was one of the residents. But that's about where the commonalities end and where Usama Khan's like amazing trajectory takes off. He is a neurologist in Boston at the Massachusetts General Hospital. We first met completing his neurocritical care fellowship at Mass General Brigham. He stayed on to take a second fellowship in clinical neurophysiology and epilepsy at Mass General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He has a real passion for creating artwork inspired by his clinical practice of neurology, through which he aims to capture various neurological disease processes. Below is just one example, which we're going to hear about more in his talk. His collective of artwork is titled Neural Blends, and his work has been showcased at art shows, events, including neurological conferences, and published most recently as cover art for Neurology Clinical Practice Journal. So without further ado, I welcome neurologist, artist, and dare I say, friend, Dr. Usaamah Khan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Galina, for such a wonderful introduction. And as always, you are truly the embodiment of just radiating positivity. So I appreciate that. And our times in the neuro ICU are ones I always remember very fondly, despite how challenging they could have been. And I want to thank the Neurohumanities Network for hosting me tonight. I think the work that this platform does, honestly, it's truly incredible. Creating the space that you do is one that I think is very important, very special, of course, to me. And I also want to thank everyone that's joining us on the session tonight. So, as Galina mentioned, I am a neurologist, but I have a sort of particular interest, a more recently developed interest, I would say, over the last few years, as I started practicing neurology more in the clinical setting, a interest of sort of art and creating artwork that is inspired largely by my patients. I think that there is a lot to be said when it comes to the intersection of art and neuroscience. And so, as I was thinking about how to put this sort of little session together, where a large part of that I would love to share with you all some of my artwork and sort of what the inspiration behind some of those pieces are. I also felt it's important to maybe just do a little bit of a sort of recognition of the rich history of just art and science in general. And I think specifically the sort of representation of science in various art forms. And that's sort of going to be the goal and the journey of this talk today is to for us to sort of bring together the two very unique but oftentimes sort of complementing worlds of science and art. And I shared this illustration here, which I came across many years ago, and I'm sure many of you have likely seen this in various formats. And it really struck me as one that it seems to create this delineation, a very kind of strict delineation between all things analytical and all things sort of methodical, and then all things creative. And there's always been this concept of, left-brained versus right-brained, where the left-brained individuals or left-minded folks tend to have a lot more of a sort of a method to them, scientists, mathematicians, engineers, doctors. And then there's folks that fit the criteria or the spectrum of sort of right-brained individuals where there's, the creative side and like the more artistic side. And to some degree, I've always had a bit of a issue with that sort of approach. I think what we understand about the brain is it's very fluid. And I think we recognize that these various parts of our brain that are responsible for maybe the more sort of, creative side versus the more methodical sides, I think we recognize that they speak with each other and they complement each other. And I think to some degree, each of us has the ability to tap into our creative elements as well as our sort of more structured elements. And really, that's where the journey began for me. Growing up, I was never really an artistic person, I think. I was very much about sort of the sciences and academics and sports, and I really never uh, took a dive into the creative side of myself. And I would give a shout out to my sister, my younger sister. She's really the one that I think is the kind of artist in the family, and she's the one that I would say inspired me to tap into my creative side a little bit. And I became fascinated with this idea of, the creative side to myself, my right brain and my left brain talking to each other. And so that fascination shows itself in various formats across my little tiny Boston apartment, where I have little things that remind me of this. So this is my mouse pad, and I have another illustration of that left brain versus right brain sort of hanging up on my wall. Because I think, my personal journey with bringing together art and neurology is really embodied by this illustration. So what am I hoping for sort of us to explore tonight? Um, First of all, just a little bit of time spent on the historical representation of neurological diseases in art forms. When we look at the history of neurology and we look at the history of art, one would think that, art and artistic history spans back centuries, if not millennia, whereas neurology is something we think of as a slightly more sort of recent discovery or a more recent understanding. But I think we can maybe explore that there's a little bit more overlap to that than we realize. And I think the influence of art on our ability to understand medicine and our ability to understand science and how science and medicine has evolved over time and the implications that art has had on that, I think is a very important and sort of central to this bridge that we're trying to create between the two. Um, then a little bit of personal touch, neural blends, which Galina kindly mentioned, and sort of a personal project and portfolio of mine that I've been working on that I would love to share with you all. And I think that there's a lot out there that exists on what can we do with the information? People like ourselves in sort of the neurohumanities space where we try and find the intersection between our sort of academic, medical, sort of clinical sides, as well as the sort of creative, artistic sides. How can we bridge the two to bring some type of meaningful impact to the world around us? And if there's time, I'd love to try and explore that as well. So, as mentioned, I'm currently a epilepsy fellow. So, though I have a love for all neurological disorders or a passion for caring for patients with all neurological disorders, at this point in time, my life has largely been sort of captivated by epilepsy. And I wanted to share here the sort of, to my surprise, the fact that epilepsy as a disease actually is present, or records of it are present dating back thousands of years. And actually, sort of, there was an Akkadian tablet found in Mesopotamia. With it, there or on it, there were inscriptions that were describing what many of us now realize is the way we actually describe certain seizure semiologies by the International League Against Epilepsy's sort of criteria or their language, where there is a description of this neck turning to the left, hands and feet are tense, and the eyes are wide open. And from his mouth, froth is flowing without him having any consciousness. I think anybody that has any type of, very rudimentary understanding of seizures would read this and say, this is a description of a seizure. And this is dating back 4,000 years ago. Almost 1,000 years later, the Babylonians in sort of current day Iran, Iraq, they wrote a diagnostic manual that was entitled Sakiku, which also included texts that describe epilepsy. And the tablet actually described terms that are related to epilepsy, such as miktu, which means fall, hayatu, which is fit, and an actual word for seizure, siptu. And so, this is I think, a really important reminder for us that neurological diseases are things that really have been recognized, not only present, they've certainly been present, but they've been recognized as far as sort of the human record goes. And over time, of course, we have seen various representation of neurological or other sort of diseases in art form, even though at the time these art forms were created, the artists or the folks that were actually creating these pieces may not have recognized the work that they're doing in providing us with an insight into what people's perception of diseases were. So, a lot of our current understanding of how certain disease processes were perceived and viewed throughout history comes from the representation of such possible disease processes in the artistic representation of those times. And so art has, of course, played a substantial role in how human history has been recorded and documented through the ages. But I think it also provides a significant lens into the evolution of medicine and science as well. So there was this long-standing belief that epilepsy was actually a spiritually based demonic condition resulting from the possession of evil spirits. And throughout most of history, seizures were thought to be caused by evil spirits, either invading the body or otherwise sort of requiring an exorcism or spiritual remedies. And we've seen examples of this through various sort of artwork that exists. So shown here is the Meister de Halgien Severin, and this is dating back to the 1300s. And this picture or this painting basically shows Saint Severin curing a woman of the fallen sickness demon. So there was this sickness that was considered a demonic sort of condition, which the interpretation of this piece, if you look into it, really points to this likely being a representation of epilepsy at the time that was perceived as a demonic spiritual condition. Hippocrates, who we know is sort of considered the father of current day medicine, was probably the first person that actually recognized epilepsy as a condition that actually may be based in some type of neurological phenomenon. But prior to Hippocrates, it had been considered a demonic sort of experience. And well after Hippocrates, up until the 13, 14, 1500s, it was still considered to be such. This is another, I think, very sort of a iconic painting. I'm sure many of you may be familiar with this, the Transfiguration. And the Transfiguration was actually the last painting by the Italian high Renaissance master Raphael, whose work I think is, sort of passes or surpasses sort of, all time and all sort of history. And this piece, Raphael, was actually commissioned by Pope Clementine VII as a piece that they wanted for the Narbonne Cathedral in France. And currently, this piece is in the Vatican City. And this painting depicts two sort of consecutive biblical narratives. And the upper register that we can see over here was the sort of transfiguration of Christ on Mount Tabor, where there's this transfigured sort of Christ floating in front of illuminated clouds. And besides him are other prophetic beings that are speculated to have been Moses and Elijah. And what I want to bring particular attention to is actually the lower register. And if you look into the sort of iconography and interpretation of the lower register, it refers to this as being Raphael depicting the apostles attempting to free a possessed boy of his demonic possession. And they were unable to cure him of the sick child, or they were unable to cure the sick child until the arrival of the recently transfigured Christ who performs a miracle. And what's described in sort of the further interpretation of this is the youth is no longer prostrate from his seizure, but is standing on his feet and his mouth is open. And experts that have interpreted this piece have actually recognized this as another very iconic sort of representation of epilepsy or pediatric or childhood epilepsy that clearly still existed at that time. I would be remiss to have a conversation or a talk about, the intersection of neurosciences and art without paying due diligence to Leonardo da Vinci, whose I think entire legacy was built on, amongst many other things, of course, but I think his work in neuroscience and art sort of is second to none. And really, the more you look into it, the more intriguing it is just how far ahead of his time Leonardo's work was. A lot of his work that looked into neuroanatomy, he did a lot of work where he looked into neuroaesthetics and how the brain processes beauty. His understanding of visual perception, his understanding of how the brain potentially processes depth, light, and forms interpretation of images was, centuries ahead of his time. And then furthermore, his understanding and his work as far as emotion and cognition goes, I think is something that is extremely vital to the work that he did and our current day understanding of neurosciences and human anatomy. So we know Leonardo performed, that human dissections at hospitals in Florence, Milan, Rome, really all over sort of Europe, where he meticulously studied the brain, the nerves, and sensory organs. And in fact, his anatomical drawings of the brain and the nerves and the skull are amongst the first highly detailed and actually accurate representations of neural structures. For example, so these are all sort of drawings that were made by Leonardo da Vinci, and he was actually one of the first to identify the presence of ventricles or these fluid-filled cavities within the brain, and even postulated their possible role in cognition. And the way that he was able to do this was actually by injecting various waxes and dyes into human skulls, and based off of that, actually creating a sort of 3D image or rendering of what he thinks the inside of the brain looks like. And if you look at a sagittal view of any current day CT or MRI, I mean, this is pretty impressively close to what we see now. Even his drawings of the various foramina and the way that the nerves are exiting various foramina was truly centuries ahead of his time. Another really sort of fascinating part with Leonardo's work was was his understanding and interest and fascination with vision and perception. Leonardo da Vinci had a deep fascination of how the brain processes visual information. And this is something that really influenced both his art and his scientific theories. He spent a lot of his time drawing the orbits, the retina, the optic nerves. You can see here, the optic chiasm, the optic nerves coming together, forming the optic chiasm, the orbital cavity. He had a very, very sort of detailed understanding of neuro-ophthalmological anatomy and likely to some degree physiology. He believed the eye as the window to the brain. Leonardo believed that vision was the most important of the five senses, and he called the eye the window of the soul. And we know that, as I already mentioned, he spent a lot of his time making detailed images of various sort of eye and orbit structures. But he was also one of the first to describe binocular vision, noting how the brain merges two slightly different images from each eye to create depth perception. And this may seem very intuitive to us, but for, thinkers at that time, this was a very novel, very unique concept. And this understanding of binocular vision and depth perception, a very sort of astute neurological observation, actually influenced his use of perspective and what's called chiaroscuro. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but this is a term that basically refers to the use of light and shadow to create sort of a specific image or to create depth. And this is something that Leonardo did. He created depth and he created realism in his paintings. Some of, the classics such as The Last Supper and the Mona Lisa are still now sort of recognized as paintings that are the best representation of that. He also developed, or I guess mastered, this technique of sfumato, which is this soft, blurred transition between colors and edges that really is sort of mimicking this area beyond what the human eye is focusing on, sort of the out of focus plane, if you will. And we already know that he had a very sort of deep fascination with visual processing and visual anatomy. And what I think is quite remarkable is, if you look at the actual or try to understand the visual cortex, particularly V1, which is the primary visual cortex. That's the area that's involved with sort of processing gradients and edges. And it does so through specialized neurons that specifically respond to orientations and line endings, which is sort of forming the foundation of visual perception. And these specific orientation selective cells were actually discovered by two scientists, Hubel and Wiesel, for which they won the Nobel Prize. But we've identified specific orientation selective cells within the visual cortex that are, very important in how we look at edges and gradients, along with other specialized cells that are called end-stop cells. And these are very important at detecting certain line endings. And all of these collectively contribute to our perception of edges and contours and are highly sensitive to the orientation of edges and lines, meaning that they sort of, respond more strongly to stimuli with a particular orientation. Now, I don't think Leonardo da Vinci had the understanding or the ability to recognize these specific cells that were discovered centuries later, but he seemed to have had a perception of the sfumato, which is the ability to recognize that how he uses gradients and how he uses specific orientations and the use of shadows has a direct impact on how it's actually processed by specific cells within the visual cortex. And so the Mona Lisa, known famously for her shifting expression, it really plays on the visual perception and sort of the brain's interpretation that now that we understand how the visual cortex tries to organize this information and understand this information makes a lot of sense. And so I find, that that's truly very, very remarkable that Leonardo da Vinci had that type of a astute understanding of very sort of detailed aspects of his artwork. His work, continues. We know that Leonardo had a huge amount of influence and impact on theories on cognition and emotion. The sensus communis theory, which is something that Aristotle sort of first brought into view, this sort of referring to this faculty of the mind that integrates and unifies the data that we receives from the five senses and is sort of unified in some capacity that we don't really realize. And Leonardo was the first person who kind of built off of that theory and hypothesized that there's likely a part of the brain where all of the sensory information converges and is processed. And he actually postulated that the second ventricle was the point of sensory convergence. Now, though anatomically incorrect, it was not the second ventricle. But we actually now recognize that there actually is an area in the brain, the thalamus specifically, that acts as this, central point for sensory convergence. And so, in a way, his theory actually was proved to be very true. So as you may have already learned by now, I have a very deep fascination and admiration for Leonardo da Vinci. So I wanted to spend some time to just pay homage to him. But this is actually some of Leonardo da Vinci's sort of sketches and scripts that I have in my apartment hanging above my TV. So I wanted to share this, one of my prized possessions that I guess is my way of just remembering some of the great work that Leonardo has done. But there's many other artists, many other physicians, many other creative geniuses over the course of time that I think have really blended together the world of science and the world of art. Andreas Vesalius being another one of them. He was an anatomist and a physician, really considered the founder of modern human anatomy, an exceptionally accomplished individual. The day that he graduated from medical school, he was offered the position of chair of surgery and anatomy at the University of Padua. He went on to create this book that now is really the sort of the fundamental source off of which our understanding of human anatomy has developed, the De Humana Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem, which is on the fabric of the human body. And this was a series of 7 books and really heavily relied on Andreas's artistic sort of acumen and skills, where he was able to sort of use his artistic mastery to create sketches of human anatomy, which then became the building blocks and the foundation off of which, medicine and our understanding of anatomy continue to develop. As we go on into the 18th and 19th centuries, we yet again continue to see more examples of the intersection of the arts and the sciences. Johann Wolfgang Goethe, widely regarded as the greatest and probably most influential writer in sort of German language, he did a lot of different sort of things in his life, but considered the theory of colors to be his most impactful work. And Goethe characterized color as arising from dynamic interplay of light and darkness. And his theories were widely adopted by the artists sort of around the world and really has become the center point off of which our current understanding of color theory has developed. The likes of Hermann von Helmholtz, he was a German physicist and a physician who spent a lot of his time dedicated to understanding the mathematics of the eye, the theories on vision. He did a lot of research on color vision and built a lot of the ideas that we now understand about visual perception. And it's thought that, a lot of his work actually influenced a lot of the artists from the Impressionist era and the Post-Impressionists, artists such as Monet and Van Gogh. Because Hermann proposed that visual perception involves these unconscious inferences where the brain interprets sensory data and uses prior knowledge to create a representation of a world rather than passively receiving a direct image. So really creating this sort of very real life image and kind of transcending the canvas and going into a place that feels real, because that's what our visual perception can allow us to do. And the likes of Monet, for example, really built off of that. And so this here is the Impression Soleil Levant, which was really so this translates to impression rising of the sun. And this has been credited with actually inspiring the name of the Impressionist movement. And this is really an example of Monet's understanding of the ability to create sort of motion and vibrance in his painting, as if we're actually seeing the shimmering of the lights on the water, the fog sort of drifting through the skies. And again, his understanding of color theory and his use of color scales to create an emotion of dullness and blankness, which is contrasted with this radiant orange luminance with which the sun emerges. So truly an embodiment of sort of the scientific work that had already been done prior to this, that kind of laid the foundations for a lot of the artists to build upon. As we go into the 20th century, again, we see a lot of influence coming from psychologists, neuropsychologists, neuroscientists, understanding the human brain, understanding the subconscious, understanding our sort of, the hidden layers in our subconscious. The surrealism, which is the sort of form of artistry that the likes of Salvador Dali really explored with. There's a lot of thought that, surrealists were really inspired by some of the theories by Freud. The Gestalt psychology really influenced art movements by, studying how we perceive forms and patterns. Gestalt psychology really looked at emphasizing perception of whole patterns rather than individual elements. So this is like an example where we can all clearly see there is a triangle in the middle, a white triangle, but there actually isn't. It's just that's something that there's pattern recognition. Our mind is creating something that doesn't actually exist. This piece by Salvador Dali, The Persistence of Memory, one of my favorite paintings. And in this painting, Salvador Dali really explores the concept of chaos and fluidity and the non-linear nature of time and memory. And the soft watches that we see were an unconscious symbol of the relativity of space and time. And, they represent the surrealist view of this collapse of our notions of a fixed cosmic order. And if you read into the history or the interpretation of the persistence of memory, there's speculation that Dali actually took inspiration from Albert Einstein's, at the time, very new, very controversial theory of relativity, which had sort of come out about a decade or so before this, and really sort of shook the world and its understanding of time. As mentioned, this really is one of my favorite pieces, and so I keep it on the back of my phone to remind myself of the, just how important and how quickly fading time is. Now coming into sort of mid-20th century, this is where we see a lot of the abstract and expressionists sort of meeting with the neurosciences. Jackson Pollock, one of my favorite artists, did a lot of work where he, does drip paintings. And a lot of his work, so this is a painting, it's called Pollock number 18. All of his pieces are just given numerical numbers. And I think that really adds to the abstractness of it. He really wants each piece to be whatever you interpret it to be. And as such, each piece just has a numerical title. And there's been sort of a lot of analysis of his work that seems to be very fractal-like structures that seem to sort of represent or show links between artistic intuition and a lot of our brain processes or synapses, for example. In the 20th century, we've also had a lot more neuroscientists that really have looked into exploring sort of, how abstract art and neural mechanisms influence our aesthetic perception. Dr. Ramachandran is someone that I came across through a TED Talk many years ago, and he has done a lot of work exploring the concept of prosopagnosia. And that actually, listening to his TED Talk, really influenced one of my first pieces that I created. So where does this lead to kind of my personal journey? So I wanted to kind of first take some time to actually look into the history of art and science, and specifically art and neurology, because I think there's a very, very rich history there. And that's sort of what has, in a way, inspired me to uh, explore that further in my own very limited capacity. I still chuckle at the idea of being called an artist because I think I am far from. But I think what I'm truly intrigued by is the undeniable sort of bridging that I think can occur between these two very incredible disciplines. So that brings us to Neural Blends, which is sort of the name of my collective. And I came up with Neural Blends in my first year of the last year of med school, first year of residency. This is when I was about to start my journey of neurology. I had been reading the works of Oliver Sacks. I had been hanging out with my sister in Toronto, who's on my case about, going into the artistic space. And that's when I wanted to get a sense of, let me explore. And over time, what has happened with Neural Blends is it's actually become a platform that I think helps, at least for me, hopefully achieve a number of different objectives. I think, first of all, there's a huge sort of educational component that I'm hoping to achieve with, creating artwork that's inspired by neurology. I think that a lot of neurological diseases have very specific criterias and specific, diagnostic, very kind of textbook diagnostic sort of keywords. There's a lot of various elements of physiology that can sometimes be a little bit tough to sort of grasp or capture, but I try to put that in a artistic form, and with hopes of, capturing attention and garnering sort of, the intrigue from, say, neurological trainees. I also really want to use my artwork to empower my patients. And I've been very sort of humbled and really sort of taken aback by some of the feedback that I've gotten from patients that have actually come across the artwork, where they feel empowered because neurological diseases can be very scary. They can be very stigmatizing. They can be very, insulating for the people that do live with them. But to try and create a artistic expression of them where I'm trying to bring some type of beauty, some type of, expression beyond just their symptoms and deficits has been something that many patients have really appreciated. I was at the Epilepsy Foundation of New England gala earlier this year, where some of the work was being showcased, and some of the parents of epilepsy patients actually, approached me and were very taken aback by, like, we didn't think, that our providers were thinking of, our kids or, their patients outside of the clinic and in such a deep way. So for me, this really is an expression of helping to empower my patients, or anyone that doesn't really know about neurological diseases and is hoping to learn some. And then lastly, I think to inspire, and really this is to inspire physicians, inspire artists, inspire anyone that's looking for inspiration, that, whether it's learning about neurological conditions, whether it's about learning about some of the stories of patients that actually did really well, which hopefully other patients can take inspiration from, or if it's inspiring artists to try and, expand sort of their horizons within the artistic space and hopefully want to delve into sort of the health sciences and clinical space. So what we'll do now is, go through some of my art pieces, and I'll kind of explain what each of these are trying to represent. So this was one of the pieces that I made called Sclerosis. Each of my pieces is usually inspired by either a patient encounter or a clinical sort of scenario that I was in. This one particularly was inspired by a patient that I had earlier this year with medication refractory temporal lobe epilepsy. As we know, epilepsy can be a life sort of altering, disabling condition. This specific patient's epilepsy was originating from her hippocampus, The hippocampus is the medialmost part of the temporal lobe and oftentimes implicated in temporal lobe epilepsies. And hippocampus is actually a Latin word for seahorse. And if you look at the actual anatomical structure of a hippocampus, it very much represents a seahorse. And so in this patient's actual semiology, or the presentation of her seizures, where she would have sort of changes in her speech, and she would do this behavior where she would bring her hands up to her face and then have perseveration of speech. And so every time there was a masking of her face and then a loss of awareness. And so we were able to do a fairly thorough workup that involved actually resection and removal of part of her temporal lobe, which helped with significant reduction in her seizures. This is me sort of trying to capture the unmasking of her face, which is kind of what we were hoping to do with, seizure freedom. And the hippocampus is represented by the seahorse. The purple color is, again, as some of you may or may not know, but purple is the color for epilepsy. And so I wanted to go with that color. This next piece is Lumen absence. And this is a slightly, more cynical, I guess, piece, in the sense that this is a representation of death by neurological criteria. And death by neurological criteria is basically when there is a irreversible cessation of all brain and brainstem activity, and really requires a very meticulous set of clinical tests. But in certain situations, in certain scenarios, when portions of that clinical test cannot be performed, we then resort to other ancillary modalities, one of which is nuclear perfusion imaging. And what nuclear perfusion imaging does is it basically looks at the blood flow to the brain. And in someone that has irreversible injury to the brain, with complete cessation of brain and brainstem activity, or brain dead, there is loss of blood flow to their internal carotid arteries, which goes into the brain, and a relative increase of blood flow to the temporal regions. And so with the perfusion study, you're looking at the radiotracer uptake, and what you expect to see is what is described as this empty bulb or a hot nose sign. And so if you actually look at images of nuclear perfusion studies, it sort of mimics this, where you have loss of radiotracer uptake in the cerebrum and a relative increased uptake of radiotracer in the temporal regions. And so I tried to use that to create this sort of ghost-like, eerie image that captures a sort of death by neurological criteria in almost like a ghost-like fashion. And you can kind of see the fading away is really the sort of fading away into another realm. Dystonia. So this was a piece that was also inspired by a patient I took care of in residency. This was also inspired by one of my favorite artists, Picasso, who I did not actually, give a shout out to earlier on. But Picasso really used this cubism style, where he would use block shapes to form distorted images of like humanoid figures. And there again has been postulation of certain neuropsychiatric as well as neurological disease conditions that it seems like Picasso was trying to capture. There's many diseases where our perception of, faces, and our perception of human figures and just orientation of size gets impacted. And I think Picasso really played with that. But I sort of use that cubism style to capture a very different disease process. So this is dystonia, and this painting is capturing what we call faciobrachial dystonic seizures. And this was a patient that I had in residency that had a paraneoplastic encephalitis. So what that basically means is there's a tumor in the body that was creating these antibodies that were basically attacking the patient's brain and nervous system. And what that resulted in are these specific seizures that cause movements in the face and the arm. And there were like these jerk-like movements that the patient was having upwards of 60 of these per day. And he had a pretty extensive workup before coming to us, and it was unclear why he was having these that were not really responsive to any anti-seizure medications. We ended up doing a pretty extensive workup, and he was ultimately found to have this encephalitis from a thymoma. He ultimately underwent treatment with, removal of the thymoma, treatment with immunotherapies as well as anti-seizure medication, and fortunately had resolution of his seizures. What I'm capturing here are the actual antibodies. So these antibodies are anti-LGI1 antibodies. And what we can see here are the letters L, G, I, and 1. And at the same time, they're trying to capture the symptomatology, the facial brachial, so arm and face. So I have the patient's face here as well as the arms that were impacted. And then these Ks represent Ks for potassium, and these are voltage-gated potassium channels, are the ones that these antibodies basically attack that cause the disease. Prosopagnosia, this is my first ever neural blends piece, and probably still one of my most cherished, probably because it sort of came from sort of very early on in my journey. As I mentioned earlier, there was a TED talk that Dr. Ramachandran gave where he described and talked about prosopagnosia. Then I read about it, and I really tried to make sense of what prosopagnosia may look like and may feel like. And it's basically a condition that results in facial blindness. There's actually no visual field deficits that patients have. It's truly a facial recognition impairment. And it results from either injury or some type of dysfunction in a specific part of the brain that is involved in recognizing faces. It's the fusiform gyrus. And a lesion to that part of the brain basically renders you unable to recognize faces. Yet these patients are still able to lead a relatively normal life because you're able to pick up on other social cues, body language, etc. They're able to recognize who someone is through a lot of other sort of tells, but are unable to recognize a face. And so in this image, there I tried to do my own sort of take of working with edges and working with some amount of depth perception. But if you stare at it long enough, you can sort of start to see a face emerge, but really there isn't a face there. And this is my, I guess, artistic sort of representation of what I think prosopagnosia may look like. This is a piece that was inspired by Jackson Pollock, as I mentioned. So Jackson Pollock, that we already talked about, has done a lot of creating beauty out of chaos and creating something out of order. Creating something when there's a complete lack of order. Something that still appears coordinated and beautiful, yet is fully engrossed in absolute chaos. And this was something that I felt in some ways sometimes describes, and Galina may also reminisce on some of our neuro ICU times. But this to me, in a way, is how I sometimes felt in the neurological ICU, taking care of very, very devastating neurological conditions, very, very difficult, patients where not only is there a neurological crisis, but there is a, multi-system crises where organs are failing and you are trying to do everything to keep a patient alive. And sometimes you kind of feel like there's a loss of hope or you feel like there's absolute chaos. Yet somehow you find your way to find some beauty in that and try to create order out of that. So this was a representation of that. At the same time, this also, one of the things that I do with my artwork is I really keep myself open to letting the painting sort of lead the way. And many times what I have in my mind is not really what ends up on the canvas. And so I've gotten comfortable with the idea of, flexibility and going with the flow. And as I started creating this, I kind of started chuckling to myself and I said, well, hey, these almost kind of uh, look like synapses, and specifically sort of mossy fibers that are these neurons within our cerebellum that are really important for coordination, and they really help perfect our coordination. And I thought that was also a very interesting parallel, because here I am trying to create sort of order out of chaos, and that's actually exactly what the mossy fibers do, is where they help to bring order to our movement. They coordinate and perfect our movement, and sort of bring order to our motor dexterity. This piece, Fallen Butterflies, was inspired by a patient that I took care of when I was in residency at the Veterans Hospital, who, unfortunately suffered from pretty advanced Parkinson's disease. He also was a boxing fan. So he and I talked about boxing, and we talked about Muhammad Ali, who, as you all may know, himself suffered from Parkinson's disease. And so I wanted to create something that pays respect to patients with Parkinson's disease, as well as I'm a boxing fan. I've always been a fan of boxing, and anyone I think that's a boxing fan has to be a fan of Muhammad Ali. And so, you know, Ali in his later years suffered from Parkinson's, which we know is a neurological disorder, movement disorder that is due to depletion in the substantia nigra, which ironically is Latin for black substance, which I think Muhammad Ali himself was an absolute, a black man of absolute substance. And so that's the underlying sort of cause of Parkinson's disease. And for those who know Muhammad Ali, you may know he had this famous quote, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And it was because of his swift speed and his fluidity. And he was known for this famous Ali shuffle, the way he would kind of shuffle his feet. And what was very ironic is, he was stripped of these very things, as they actually represent many of the cardinal features in Parkinson's. We know Parkinson's patients have literally what is described as a shuffling gait. They have a complete loss of fluidity, and in fact have rigidity, sort of this lead pipe rigidity that patients have. And what I also thought was interesting with the butterfly notion, if you look at cross sections of the substantia nigra, it actually looks like the wings of a butterfly. And that's basically what I'm trying to capture here. So this is a famous image from Ali versus Liston, where he actually is standing in this very same sort of in this very same posture, standing over Sonny Liston. And what I thought was interesting is it in a way kind of foreshadowed some of the symptoms that we see with Parkinson's. There's usually some amount of unilateral sort of presentation of symptoms. The cogwheel rigidity, oftentimes, whenever you hear anyone describe cogwheel rigidity, it's very much this sort of flex tonic sort of positioning of the arm. And then I tried to sort of, demonstrate these masked faces that patients have. And then these butterflies, fallen butterflies. Why? Because, to me, that is representation of the substantia nigra. It also was really the representation of Muhammad Ali, was his ability to float like a butterfly. Galina, how are we doing on time?
You still have
We
about 2 minutes, but we started a little bit later, so please take your time.
Okay, perfect. This is a piece, Inferno. This was inspired by a patient that I took care of in residency, capturing another autoimmune process, anti-NMDA encephalitis. And anti-NMDA encephalitis is a very, very scary, very eerie autoimmune encephalitis that can result in a whole host of neuropsychiatric as well as neurological symptoms. This patient was on her way to PT school in Chicago when she suddenly developed depression, a loss of sense of self. she then went on to develop catatonia and seizures, and was later found to have a diagnosis of autoimmune encephalitis that we captured or that we were able to confirm with CSF and serological testing. The elements of the disease that I'm trying to capture here, first of all, is this sort of sense of fading away, this depersonalization that is oftentimes described by these patients. There's also a certain eeriness and a certain, again, I was trying to use my somewhat understanding of, colors, color theory, and sort of the impressionist style to try to capture emotion in image form, and really trying to create a sense of discomfort and eeriness that the viewer may feel when they see this, because that is really what sort of I think embodies the disease process. And then there's sort of this halo of red, this sort of inferno around, and that's to capture the encephalitis, which means inflammation of the brain. Then you may notice these sort of ant-like bodies that I've sort of had disseminated around here, and that's really to capture the antibody mediated. There's really a dissemination of ant-like bodies throughout that is the cause of this disease. And one of the classic EEG patterns that we see in patients that have autoimmune encephalitides are these delta waves with delta brushes. And so they're in a way trying to capture clouds, but it's also trying to capture the very pathognomonic EEG findings. And with that, I have some birds in here, but really what the birds are immunoglobulins, because we know that the Y is sort of the representative letter for immunoglobulins. And in her case, the treatment with IVIGs is what really freed her from her disease, in addition to other therapies. And I often think of, birds in the sky as sort of the ultimate representation of freedom. I also want to recognize one of my co-residents, Anton Ostashko, who he and I together actually worked on this piece. I do have a few more, but I want to respect time, so I'm gonna take a pause here, and Mattia sort of let me know.
Usaamah, that was absolutely wonderful. I think we can start our Q&A, and then if we have some extra time before the close of the hour, maybe you can show us a few of those beautiful paintings. But first of all, I want to thank you for this stellar overview of the relationship between the world of art and the world of perception, and then also for showing us your fantastic artwork. I had seen a few of these, but hearing you talk about them was wonderful. Now I know that we have a few artists, we have a few art enthusiasts in the group, and I want to ask you all to raise your hand if you have any questions, so that we can know if you have anything to ask or to add. Um, in the meantime, I'll start off by asking you a question, Usaamah. Um, you were talking about iconography and the role of iconography in portraying what certain conditions are. And I find that a lot of the time, for people that are not in medicine, their first time encountering a medical condition may be through artwork, TV, or film, and even where certain neurological conditions or medical conditions get used for as signifiers for something else, epilepsy and possession. I would love a comment that you may have on this.
Yeah, I think you are really identifying one of the things that I think inspires me to want to really sort of dig into this space is exactly that. I think there is a very real sort of stigma that exists, or if maybe it's a fear or a stigma or maybe an ignorance towards neurological diseases and conditions. I think we all recognize they can be very scary. I think we all recognize that they can be very hard to understand and very hard to, make sense of. And maybe art form is the way for people to get some type of exposure, but also to be able to absorb the information in a way that makes it a little bit more understandable, maybe a little bit more sort of, a little bit more impactful, and a little less scary. And I think that's sort of, if you open up Wikipedia, or you open up sort of, a textbook and read about autoimmune encephalitides, I think for many people, it may not connect. It may not make sense. It may not really tell the story of what does a patient with autoimmune encephalitides, what are they suffering with? And so that is really one of my goals. When I talk about educate and empower, I think those are the things that I want to try and do with the artwork. Because yes, iconography is a big, big part of abstract artwork, I think. It really allows the viewer to make sense of what they're seeing. I sometimes question myself if my work is truly abstract or not. I feel like I have an abstract take on it because um, there's a lot of, and maybe some of the artists in the audience can actually help me clarify my thoughts around this. But I've always thought of my work as being abstract. But then at the same time, I'm trying to deliver a very intentional message. So is it really abstract, or is it really just a abstract rendering of something that's a lot more precise that I'm trying to deliver?
Yeah, those are wonderful thoughts. And speaking of artists, in our group we have a comment for Priya Rama, and Priya, please feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask it live. But I want to say that Priya is a wonderful artist who also suffers from migraine, and she did a session for a prior group I was part at. And her artwork is all based on representing the experience of any migrants. And Priya, please feel free to chime in because I don't wanna speak for you. And her question is rendering in art increasing your understanding of your patient's medical condition?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. Um, there's two ways that I think about that, because I think about my understanding of neurological diseases and neurological conditions, I think is almost entirely coming from studying it, practicing it in the clinical setting. And I would say that's where my left brain really kicks in and takes over in sort of the line of work that I do. But what I have realized, the more that I've tried to grow in this space, is understanding the patient's perspective and understanding the patient's journey and understanding their story, is something that I've paid a lot more attention to and paid a lot more, I think, intentional detail to, because some of that is what I'm trying to capture in my artwork. And so, in a way, I would say, yeah, I think it's informed my understanding of medical conditions as it relates to the experience of the patient rather than my physiological understanding of a disease process. I think I sort of separate that, but my understanding of the patient experience, or at least my intent with wanting to deeply empathize with it and spend time thinking about it, is something that I think has tremendously helped me.
That's wonderful. I wonder, Priya, if you have something to add to that.
I don't know if you can see me or hear me. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan and Mattia, for including me in this conversation. But for me, having suffered from migraines my whole life and having just started painting them recently, I think I better understand my migraines now that I paint them, because it almost feels like I have a inside out perspective of the thing, like of understanding what is really happening inside my body. And I don't think anyone else could explain that to me other than myself. So I had to turn inward to better understand, like, and connect the dots to all the different things that were happening to me, both like visually and like different senses, and like the thirst and hunger and everything else I would feel, and the flashing lights. And now I see the connections now that I paint them.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, I love that you are using art as a platform to capture, because I think your experience as the patient that is experiencing the migraines. I think to be able to represent that in an artistic way, I think tells a story that's very different than, for example, my interpretation of what I think my patients are experiencing. And I think that's why it's so important that, we all use some form of artistic platform to tell our individual, experience or our story. And I thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting you mentioned migraine because that's one of the paintings that I've put up right here, which was I guess I've heard so migraine auras, which many patients have described as being very different than the actual migraine syndrome. And over here, I was trying to use that sort of explosion of colors and these rays of lights and auras that patients sometimes experience, or what I think they experience. So I don't know if this is at all relatable for you or not.
It is relatable in terms of the flood of colors that I'm seeing and all the textures and patterns.
Okay.
Very much so. And for me, like I don't have the classic visual aura where the vision cracks or things start to break up. I don't have that. I have intense pain. And the best way I can describe is from that intense pain and pressure, it's almost like dawn breaking. Out of the darkness, colors begin to emerge, and then they start to do all this. And it's very dimensional for me because I can travel through whatever I'm experiencing. So there are things happening all around me and inside me.
Wow.
So
Thank you for sharing that.
you're welcome.
Well, I love this. I love this exchange. Next up, we have Tatiana, who also raised her hand, and I also want to shout her out because she's, in addition to being a clinical fellow, also at the Mass General and Brigham, she also organized a wonderful series, a wonderful project called the Manet Project that really uses art as a way to teach medicine and teach neurology. Tatiana, take it away.
Thanks, Mattia. Usaamah, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for sharing your artwork, and it's been really interesting learning more about them. I've also seen them online, so it's been really interesting kind of hearing your thought process behind every artwork and kind of sharing your inspiration. I'm particularly really interested in art as a tool for just understanding ambiguity, or really at least helping physicians, especially young trainees, feel more comfortable with it. And, medicine, like art, kind of requires at least this level of comfort with uncertainty. You maybe you touched on this a bit, about this ability when you're talking about mossy enigma. But do you feel like your artistic practice has helped you tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty in your clinical practice, especially in the neuro ICU? And do you think that maybe you found yourself drawn to kind of this particular artistic style or medium, with this abstract art because of your background in neurology, where there's a lot of uncertainty as well?
Thank you so much for your question, Tatiana. First of all, I just want to say I'm very familiar with some of the incredible work you've done in the art and neurology space, and I actually read into the Manet project, and it's truly incredible. For those who don't know, Tatiana has been looking into how looking at art and art pieces can actually improve our visual recognition and how that may impact our astuteness with which we look at radiographic images, which I think is actually very incredible. So thank you for that. And I just wanted to say I was truly impressed with the work you're doing. Regarding your question about the ambiguity, I mean that's something I've often recognized and thought about that. I think that overlap. There's a lot of ambiguity that I think is a very real part of our life in the neuro ICU, and you have to get totally comfortable with that. You have to recognize that clinical conditions, clinical scenarios will fluctuate very quickly, and you kind of have to adjust with that. And the same thing applies with the painting. A lot of times I have this image in my mind that I want to create. Because I'm a very novice, barely skilled artist right now, I have to allow myself to recognize that I'm probably not going to be able to put on canvas what I have in my mind. And so that flexibility, I think, has sort of paved way for actually allowing more of that sort of abstract creative flexibility. And there is definitely that overlap. I think that in whether the artwork has affected the workspace as much, I'm not so sure. I think that very early on in my sort of neurological career, I became very comfortable with the idea of allowing for ambiguity, allowing for, things to play out and then kind of revisit the drawing board. And that's sort of what I have to do with the paintings as well.
That was phenomenal. I think in real life, from what I hear, Dr. Eric Avery raised his hands, and he's a physician and an artist and a printmaker. So correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Avery, but I think you were trying to raise your hand.
I did raise my hand. Listen, thank you very much. I'm having I'm prehistoric in my digital skills, but listen, Dr. Khan, I am a practicing artist physician and was in the Institute for Medical Humanities where they paid me a physician to make art, and I did it a lot. It helped me cope with what I did as a psychiatrist at UTMB for many years. But the comment and it's a kind of a question. First, I want to thank you for your very beautiful talk and really for illustrating, because I think this is really in the realm of what is art. These really function in an illustrative context. They illustrate. And that's tied to my question to you. In as I understand the history of Western art, that there's a pivot that happened with Marcel Duchamp around his trying to exhibit a urinal. And what happened, as I understand, the turn that happened in art was Duchamp shifted art from the optical to the conceptual. And it really opened an area for art to be much wider than an illustrative or optical. So I wanted to ask you if you think of Duchamp's switch from optical to conceptual in your own history of art. There's a question there somehow.
I'll be totally honest with you. I am not as familiar with that specific sort of switch that you're referring to. But I think the concept that you're kind of talking about, I think is something that I think really is, I think that concept is one that is sort of at the center of like what I try to do with the artwork, which is to really make it in a way where I'm telling a visual narrative. And I think that over the years, the way that I have looked into or tried to understand art as it's progressed over the years is that, it really was a tool for not only storytelling, but a tool for education and a tool for keeping records. I think a lot of our early human records actually comes from pictographs, and it comes from visual illustrations. And over time, that sort of now we look back at some of those paintings and some of that artwork, and we try and make inferences about what human society and what life was like at that time. So there's a lot of storytelling that's involved over there. And I think to some degree, what I'm trying to do with my artwork is somewhat parallel, where there's some storytelling involved in the patients that I'm seeing, the conditions that they're living. I don't know if that answers your question. It probably doesn't. And some part of that might also be I'm actually admittedly not as familiar with the specific Duchamp switch that you were referring to.
Matthias, let me just respond. So I would encourage you to look at Marcel Duchamp, and the Philadelphia Museum is the temple to all his work, and it does take you right to the urinal, but it also passes on to the work that he spent his last 20 years of his life making, which is you look through binocular peepholes. But if you showed your work to us without any text, without any narrative, just showed us the paintings, Where does that leave us?
That is a great question. And I think that's something I really do want to explore. I think I want to explore what the perception of the artwork is for an audience that truly has their own abstract take on it. And I actually have not yet explored that. Um, I think at the moment I'm still trying to build a portfolio and trying to get more sort of exposure to it. And in doing so, I think I'm leaning heavily on the story that I'm trying to tell and the sort of narratives that the paintings are capturing. I feel like at this point in my artistic journey, there's a lot of emphasis on like, hey, this is the story that I'm trying to tell. And I think that there's a degree of maturity and a degree of comfort in your art that I have to achieve, where I feel fully comfortable with the vulnerability, right, of like putting the work out there without any narrative and explanation, and allowing people to play with the art in their own capacity and to relate to the art in the way that it makes sense to them. And I actually would love to see what that would be like. I haven't yet explored that.
Yeah, it's an interesting experiment. Yeah, very nice exchange to hear. The other artwork, by the way, by Duchamp that people may be a little bit more familiar with, maybe the one that says "Ceci n'est pas un pipe." That's a little bit more maybe more world recognized, although both are, fairly well known. Thank you, Dr. Avery, for that insightful um, addition, and I'm curious to see how both of you will take this further. Next up, we have Raphael Karanang, who's also leading a local neurohumanities group at UMass and also a neurologist.
Thanks, Majaya. First of all, Osama, this is a fantastic session. Thank you so much. I have so many comments and so many things to say. I'll try to be brief. The first thing that strikes me is how you've managed to use various different styles of art to depict various neurological disorders, and the way that you tell a story, I think, really hits home in terms of how it's relatable to us as neurologists that see patients and all that. Um, the uh, the one thing that I was saying is that I think you've already achieved it, and I applaud you for your bravery, because as a failed artist that can never get my images conceptualized in reality and realized in reality, because I'm just not good. I think you've achieved that. But the one thing that I would say or would ask you about is the abstract concept. And some of us delve into abstract art because we don't have the skills to do realism. But the advantage I think that you have with the abstract art is that if it's less formed and more abstract, then it allows the viewer to participate more and interpret more, and it's more open to a collaboration or co-creation of experience with the viewer and the artist. And I think you've achieved that. And I'm not sure what your take is, and I'm sure there's a role for different kinds of art. As someone named Raphael, I love the Renaissance, but there are some authors out there, Eric Kandel in particular, that seems to think that abstract art in particular is a higher form because it allows of more of a collaborative, interpretative thing. And that takes a lot of bravery, like you said, opening your vulnerability and allowing the art to speak to people beyond what you really intended to be. So just wondering what your comments are, but congratulations. I think the art is beautiful. And I'm wondering if your paintings are for sale.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your very nice comments. In terms of the choice of abstract art, to be completely honest, I think when I first started, I really did not know where I was going with this. I sort of had a bit of a concept, and I wanted to explore it, but I really had nothing backing me to think that I had any type of artistic experience or skill set. And so the choice of using an abstract form truly came from a lack of confidence in my ability to actually do any type of realism. And I would say even now, like if, someone asks me to create a very nice detailed sketch or, try to create something that I'm seeing, I would probably struggle with that. So I think I resorted to the more kind of abstract nature of the work because that was just something I was more comfortable exploring and playing with. However, the more that I have sort of explored the abstract form, I think it actually relates very, very well with what I'm trying to achieve, which is really trying to capture things that are a little bit hard to kind of describe in a tangible form many times, right? There's oftentimes, this painting here, for example, it's wanting to capture an emotion that I felt. Other times it's trying to capture a hyper, sort of a hyper exaggerated form of a clinical syndrome, like the dystonia, for example. Uh, so I do love the abstractness of it. I think I resorted to it because of my limited sort of refined artistic skills in the beginning. Over time, it actually, I think, serves the art that I'm trying to actually produce a lot more justice. Um, over, and then I'm curious to see how this evolves as I go. Maybe if I feel more comfortable and feel like I have more finesse in my artwork, then maybe I'll try to do some more realism. But for now, this is kind of where my my art takes me. In terms of whether the artwork is for sale, currently I feel like I'm very selfish in my artwork right now. I'm building my little portfolio, little gallery that I've kept at home, and I think part of it is also an imposter syndrome. Like I just feel very uh, ashamed to even like try to make money off of it. I think for me, it's very much about it's a passion project. I love sharing it. I love for people to see the story. But I really am very humbled by you asking that. And I'm trying to explore the area of like commission work. That's something that I'm trying to do. So that's something that I've like tried to think about. Because that way from the get-go, I haven't yet developed an attachment with the piece. But most of the stuff that I've created, I usually develop a pretty significant attachment with it.
Understood. I'll just go to you when I have exhibits if you have an exhibit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about finesse, Usama. You seem to have a lot of artistic finesse. Alexei Tolchinsky was making a comment. He was thanking your gorgeous art and illuminating presentation, thoughtful, caring, and well researched. He thanked you. He said, in psychological testing with children and adolescents, at times, we find, I guess, much information from their drawings, sometimes even more than from talking to them. Depressed children use the grayscale and less vibrant colors. Children with autism sometimes draw parts of people and animals. The interpretation of these drawings is not scientific, qualitative, and necessarily inferential, but useful as one of the data sources. Some of these drawings, particularly traumatized children, speak volumes. You also reminded me, he said, of a patient in neurological clinic with global aphasia. She could not talk fluently or understand speech well, but was able to sing opera and melodies flawlessly. And then she smiled.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I think the overlap between the neurocognitive, neuropsychological sort of space and work and purely neurological, I mean, that's a huge overlap. And that's something that in epilepsy, for example, we almost always have neurocognitive and neuropsychological testing that's done for a lot of our like epilepsy surgery or pre-surgical evaluation patients. Um, and similar to what was sort of mentioned, there's a lot of times there are these sort of various uh, tests and tools that look into our visual spatial orientation and recognition, or our visual memory, or our verbal memory, etc. And I've always had a hard time really like pinpointing to how to quantify those things in a purely clinical context, and that's where we rely very heavily on our clinical psychologists, neuropsychologists to help us make sense of that. But it's often made me think about exactly what, is being mentioned here, which is that there are a lot of, there's a lot of play between how the brain processes different things and how we express that, whether that's in, imagery or otherwise. So if there's deep-rooted, depression or trauma or other types of things that affect our cognition, the way that those things manifest themselves in imagery and in art, I think is uh, there's a lot to be, there's a lot of stories to be, I think, told there.
Yeah. Well, so many comments. I love this conversation. This is what the network is all about. Thank you, in the meantime, Usaamah, for going over a few other ones of your artwork. I do think we are at time, unfortunately. So thanks again for a wonderful presentation. And if you can send us a few of the other artworks, we'd love to share them on our newsletter.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do a little shameless plug at the end here,
Please.
uh, if you bear with me. Whoops.
Absolutely. Let me unshare.
Can you still see my screen?
We can, yes.
Okay, so my website is neuralblends.com that has the full portfolio. And since we have an audience of neurologists here, for anyone that may be attending the AAN this year, there is going to be a session where there will be a lot of sort of what we went over today. And I'm forgetting who, but I think Dr. Avery posed the question of how would the artwork be perceived by an audience that doesn't have the context? And that's exactly what we're planning to explore at the AAN this year. Is this going to be a educational sort of tool where people will be presented images and then sort of asked to come up with a differential or a diagnosis without the clinical context? So if anyone's at AAN this year, I would love for you guys to stop by. It's at the Trainee Hub at 3:30. I think I'm conflicting times with Galina. So Galina, I don't mean to steal people from you, but uh that's my little shameless plug right there.
Wonderful. Well, I'll be at AE and I'll make sure to check that out for sure. All right.
Awesome. Thank
Well,
you guys so much for having me. This was great. I really enjoyed all the questions. Thank you all for your thoughtful questions and for taking the time to indulge me.
absolutely. It was our pleasure and our honor. And in the final seconds, I'll shift it over to Galina, who'll tell us what's coming up.
Yeah, actually, if you could just go back one slide, Matej, I know I kind of have the benefit of the last word, and I just wanted to once again thank you, Usaamah. I think I've been racking my brain the last couple of minutes to think like what can I possibly say to follow this? And what I really want to do is to really just go back to the word vulnerability that you said, and wondering if instead I might call what you're doing is courageous. I think that you're kind of leading from the front. You're showing what you see, and I think through your art, you're showing the meaning that you create and the beauty in our work. And I was really struck tonight to see the pieces. I've heard so much about this, but I haven't seen them all. And it kind of was like it had this settling feeling for me because when I talk to family, like there's so much difficulty and so much chaos and so much uncertainty in what we do. And yet I think part of the reason we do it, and I really can't think of another word, is because it's beautiful to see, the full range of humanity that we get to see as clinicians. So I really think your art is really beautiful, and I thank you so much for it.
Thank you so much, and thank you to you and Mattia for putting this together and for having me here. I truly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
All right, and with that, I have the sincere pleasure of announcing what's coming up down the pipeline. We have a super packed March. We are lucky to also offer this month another booster session. And as Mateo pointed out at the beginning, these are really the sessions where you roll up the sleeves and you get to practice art. So we're going to be joined by Dr. Suzanne Coven at the end of March, who's going to lead a writing workshop. So bring out your pens, your typewriters, your computers, whatever you're going to use. She's going to lead us through a writing process. She's a writer in residence at Massachusetts General Hospital. I think potentially the only hospital, as far as I know, that has this position. And she's also a well-known author. So please join us for this very special, intimate evening with Dr. Coven. And if that wasn't enough, I'm excited to say that we've confirmed our speaker for April. Back by popular demand, Dr. Javier Suarez gave this talk about a year ago when this group was just a little fledgling in-person group before we launched as the formal Neurohumanities Network. And he's actually going to be talking about the neuropsychology of comics. He's, I would say, an expert on this field, having picked so niche a topic. And in honor of Dr. Suarez and April Fool's Day, we're actually going to be bringing back a second contest. We had our first contest back in October, if you recall, with a spooky Halloween neurological interpretation. And in April, starting April 1st, we welcome you to submit your neurohumanities cartoons. We say cartoons because they can be comical, humorous, or they can be serious graphical art, anything inspired by the neurohumanities. We're going to collect them throughout the month and post them online with a vote, and the winner will get a gift card just like last time. So we hope you can start the brainstorming today. Maybe if you're inspired by the drawings you saw today or something abstract conceptual, we welcome everything. But we hope you'll join us for those sessions and participate and engage online. If you're not already part of our newsletter, feel free to bring out your phone and join via the QR code here. And as Usaamah mentioned, his work is featured on our little guide to arts and humanities event, like a little scavenger hunt through the AN, lots of different talks on history and art and the involvement in neurological fields. So look out for that in our next newsletter, as well as information on the contest. With that, I am going to close it out for the night, but we so appreciate everyone who joined us today and who joined us in prosperity with this video that's going to go online, and of course, everyone who will write in with comments and other advice. We do listen to you guys, what you want to hear, so let us know in the little feedback at the end of the session what you liked today and what you want to see more of. But thanks again.
So take care, everyone. Thanks again, Usaamah.